so much for having me here today. I was quite honored to be asked to join this list of speakers and facilitators that you have the rest of the day. Part of my goal, besides presenting some information though, is the warm-up, right? And so why not warm up with our unconscious contribution to systemic inequity, right? And ease in, we're just gonna ease into that. No, but before we jump in, there is a component of a warm-up that I think is really important. And so we're going to do just very quickly a repeat after me. So I'm going to say something and then you just repeat after me. Does that sound good? Okay, so good morning.
Good morning.
I am excited to be here. I believe you. I believe you. I cannot wait to learn something new. Now, that one was interesting, kind of to taper it off. So, true or not, I now know that your voices, at least, are here. And so I hope and encourage you to use those throughout today and throughout the session this morning, and just in general at the conference, to ask questions, answer questions, and to share your story. So for me, when I begin, I think I'd like to share a little bit more about myself. So the first thing that I like to share is that I have an unhealthy love for organizing. Yeah, so some chuckles in the room. So I have some fellow organizers, probably. Everything might have a place. Maybe it even has a label. For those of you, though, who maybe didn't laugh so much, you still have a relationship, unhealthy or not, with categorizing. And that's what I want to start the conversation today talking about. So we'll see something. And what is this animal? Raccoon. Yes, your voices work. I'm so excited. Yeah? A raccoon. So we see a raccoon and then we go, okay, well, let's just file it. We're going to put it into the file folder and that's going to make sense. So staying with this theme of animals, well, what's this animal? Tiger, right? So then we see it, file it away. We figured out what that is. Another animal? Elephant. And then we file it away. But how do you know, and this is a question to you, how do you know what those animals are? You've seen them before. Experience, right? So maybe you've been told or taught what they are. And I think that's essential, right? If we were to put it into one word about what that means, experience or categorizing, we'd have to start at the very baseline conversation around schema, which many of you might have experience engaging with or understanding. But it's just a cognitive framework, right, to organize lots and lots and lots of information really quickly. And it's super useful. I think if you think back to the very beginning of our species, right, the idea of understanding danger and desire was really important, right? Being able to distinguish between those two different things. And even today, right, we're able to use schema to navigate the world. So we'll see something like this, which is an electrical outlet. We know what its purpose is. We also know that we don't stick forks in electrical outlets, yes? Maybe not. Some people who have children maybe have a different experience with what that looks like. But we also have schema that maybe says that we see banana peels and we know to be a little bit more cautious while we're walking. I don't care if you are Sam Neill or Chris Pratt, I will forever and always have a schema that if I see a velociraptor, it's not a pet and I need to run away, right? So that's something that I use. So they're incredibly, incredibly useful, right, thinking about schema. Now, what's interesting, though, is what do we do when we get new information, right? And we're building on it. We're a little bit older now, so we don't think so much about the new stuff that we experience or the new stuff that we see. But what do we do when we have new information? So I think about this person right here. This is this guy, for those of you who might know. So I might see, for example, like I see a trunk of an elephant. I see a tail of a raccoon or a cat of some sort. I see stripes like a tiger. But if anything, I'm really, really confused, right? I'm like, this doesn't quite match my experience. This doesn't quite match my beliefs. And so I start to experience this dissonance, this jarring kind of conflict with what do I do with this, right? And I think for me then, there's an opportunity, or rather a challenge, that I could very well misfile something. I'll put it into a folder that it doesn't work for. And that could be based on emotion. So if I see outstretched arms, maybe I have a schema that's really dangerous. And so I'm scared, and so I file it into like a danger or a monsters folder. That's what I end up doing. Or maybe instead, there's just so much going on that I'm just confused. I don't really know what this creature is. It's just kind of weird. So I put it into that category. Or maybe I'm super jealous that it can do all these different things. And so instead, what I'm focused on is that it's exotic. It's different than what I am, and I file it into that category. Or perhaps I realize who this is, right, and who this character is, and so I file it appropriately. And so I'm quite happy, right, with this result. Now, for those of you, who is this character? Do you know? Bing Bong. We have some inside-out Pixar lovers in the room, which I'm quite pleased about myself, right? So for those of you who don't know who Bing Bong is, he's the imaginary character, right, of the little girl in Inside Out. So lots of laughter, lots of happiness, and so that could be the place where I file something. Now, what's interesting, though, is that even how I described it, the nose of or the trunk of an elephant, stripes like a tiger, cat tail or raccoon tail, those were based on my previous experiences. So schema are incredibly useful, but the challenge that I often offer up to folks is that schema can be very problematic because they confirm our pre-existing understanding, right? They go into those files, and they can be misfiled on top of that too. And then when we start to apply that to people, that gets even more challenging. Now today, I'm talking more broadly as the introductory kind of person, right? That's my second goal, warm up, and then also kind of leaning in a little bit. But you'll dive deeper with some other folks. But I want to start that conversation, though, of how we can apply schema in a negative challenge to different people. So we're just going to practice a fill in the blank. And part of a fill in the blank is saying what schema or what understanding do we have around certain groups of people and their ability or their skills. Now, if we know these, right, these different schema, it doesn't necessarily mean that we believe them or endorse them, but we know them. And that's the starting point for this conversation. So I am going to encourage you that even if those words aren't the same, to fill in the blank for the group. Can we do that? Everyone's like, I don't know what you're going to do, right? That's okay. I encourage you, right? Remember, I want to learn something new today. I'm excited to learn something new today, maybe. So the first one. Women. Yeah, that's a common schema, right? A common stereotype, even. Women are bad drivers. Not the case all the time, but sometimes that's what it feels like. What about this? Immigrants. Yep. Mexicans, right? So a racial category of someone. Muslims, right? That's a common thing too, right? Muslims.
Can you read those for us?
Of course.
Yes, some of us are.
Of course. No, I apologize for that. So the first one is blank are really bad drivers, and some of the things offered up were women, right? All blank are criminals was offered up immigrants, right, as a component that is often heard sometimes. Blank are lazy was offered in the back was the word Mexican. Most blank hate Jews and Christians. The word Muslim was offered up, right? And the last one is blank are not as intelligent as other groups. Poor people. Other things too? I mean, there's a lot that fall into that category, right? How quickly we categorize people's intelligence based on an assumed or prescribed identity is very quick. So the reason that I talk about this is because it's taking schema and then it's applying it in this stereotyping component. Now, according to Annie, there's a lot of experience with that already in the room, understanding what stereotypes are. But I think that part of my goal, too, is to apply that to our person, right? How do we actually recognize our role both in stereotyping others as well as recognizing when we've been stereotyped ourselves. So we're going to do a quick activity. And I just want you to turn to the person next to you. And for the next 2 minutes that I'll time you, I want you to answer this question, right? We're talking about the idea that schema and stereotypes can lead to assumptions. And you're going to answer this. Have you ever experienced where someone falsely assumed something about you, or maybe even when you falsely assumed something about someone else, and what was that experience? Okay, but at your tables, turn to a partner. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, genuinely, to talk. Go ahead.
So we're female attorneys, and we were talking about how we've both had the experience of walking into a courtroom and not being treated as the attorney or not being expected to be the attorney, that people assume that we're not the attorney. In fact, more often than they assume that we are.
Thank you for sharing that. Others?
Others? You all talked at your table. Raise your hand. Good.
I need both of them.
You need both.
So I work for the United Way, and as a funder, when I enter the room, I was told just a couple weeks ago that people come to our meetings because I take attendance, and I will take points off grant applications if people don't show up and follow our rules. I beg to differ, but
Thank you for sharing that.
Right. Anybody else?
We talked about how when you see someone in a wheelchair, sometimes you assume that they're also not intellectually capable, and so you talk, like you ask the person pushing the wheelchair a question instead of assuming that they can answer for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for sharing. And, you know, as Liz mentioned at the beginning, you know, I'm the director of the Diversity Resources team, which means that we do a lot of trainings. So for me, if that gives you any context about why I'm talking with you the way I'm talking with you today, right, that there's this level of needing to apply it to our personal lives, which is a constantly part of my mission in the work that I do, right? And so being able to recognize how every day I walk into this space and my role, right, even outside of my education, my experience, my name is being misidentified, right? Or I'm being generalized about what my tasks are, right, what my responsibilities are, or even on the other side that I perpetuate stereotypes or microaggress individuals because I make an assumption about their ability. I mean, that's core and really important, because I think we want to talk about the systemic inequities part, but we have to think about ourselves and how that applies to ourselves in a number of different ways. So thank you for sharing that and for going through this. I think that for me then, I'm going to go through some lessons, and the first lesson that I learned is that those schemas can be based, and typically are based, on misinformation. And so what that can do is that can lead to stereotyping and assumption making. It seems really basic, but I think we don't engage with that enough, right? And it's something that we need to constantly and continuously be engaging with, is this lesson. But I think outside of that, I mean, we do start to have experiences where we have a lot of choice. And choice is important, too, when we're having this conversation around bias. So very openly, we're just going to do a thing called this or that, right? This or that. So I'm going to put a picture of two things up on the screen, and the way that you confirm which thing you prefer is by clapping. Pretty basic, right? A little engagement here. So we'll start off with this. So we've got cake or pie. So those of you who prefer pie, let me know. Not like one, you can like clap for cake, right? I know it's early to do that, but it's okay. There's no judgment here around when you eat your cake. So what about pie? Folks who prefer pie. I obviously have a preference. Mine is pie. So let's try again. Thank you, Teresa. So how many of you prefer cake? All right. This makes more sense. How many folks prefer pie? All right, I'm in that group too. Okay. What about something basic like the beach or lakes? This is a common question around preference. How many folks prefer the beach? Okay. Folks that prefer lakes. Okay. And this next one I know is a little controversial. But I put it up here as someone who's not originally from the state, but do want to recognize all the great work that's happening around the state. So what I like to do here is just also recognize that not everybody in Iowa City is necessarily connected to the university, and that's a positive thing, right? So those of folks who have a strong affinity towards the University of Iowa, I should clap too, I guess, right? Like that should be a very key thing. What about Iowa State? We have any Iowa Staters in the room? Yay, we got a couple folks. Yeah, for sure. What about you and I? That's a big one. Yeah. So I think here, I think about preference because it's so closely attached to emotion, and sometimes we don't even realize that we have a preference until we start to analyze that too. So when I was told that this session today was going to be at Cedar Ridge, I didn't realize this, but I had a reaction. So I got married here, actually right out there. So for me, because I am still married and still happy, right, I have a very positive affinity towards this place. And so that was important for me to recognize, too, in doing this presentation, what could or could not be guiding some of what I'm going to talk about today. Now, this is a pretty simple activity, but the reason that I do it is because I want to start separating this idea of explicit and implicit bias. I mean, the thing is, a lot of times I go into settings and we talk about bias, and there's this immediate reaction to it, and there's a qualifying of it. And there is explicit bias, and you've just proven that, right? You have preference, and that's not a negative or a positive thing. There just is preference that happens. And you endorse it. Political parties are this way, religious parties, beliefs that you hold. Now, what's challenging is on the implicit side, the unconscious side, is there's so many things that you might not endorse, right? And the Kirwan Institute actually even highlights 3 even more important points. 1, it can be counter to what your current beliefs are, right? So the idea is that that's super important. 2, it's not that your explicit bias is that far away from your implicit bias. They do impact each other, though they are separate entities and cognitive entities. And that's something that's also really important. And what's interesting is that they do have a lot of research around the idea that we have bias towards our in-group, but simultaneously the research also shows that we can have bias even about our own group, right? And that was a really hard thing for me to think about. I mean, I could say I can understand why I have preference towards folks who look like me, who have the same values as me, but then when it got into this conversation instead around that maybe I have negative bias against other folks, right, that I just start to treat them certain ways or discriminate, that was really hard for me to swallow in my own journey, right? But it was important for me to recognize. Now, again, I think that the reason that we need to talk about bias is because we're not saying to slow down everything. You know, I used to live in China, and I remember trying to navigate some of those spaces in China. If I didn't have schema and I didn't have bias, I might have never made it onto like a subway, right? Or may have never made it from like point A to point B. Because we're getting so much information, right? 11 million bits of information that I can only cognitively be aware of about 40 of those. And that's really helpful. I think that the question becomes is when do we start to slow down that process and use more critical thinking and pause, and when do we not? And that's the thing, is that oftentimes we just let the system be the system, and we think that that's the best method, and that's not always the case. So when I talk about this, though, I think it's important. A lot of folks probably have seen these tables before, but I think even if you've seen them before, this is a good exercise in talking about bias. So on your table, there's a handout, so there's the cutout of the tables as well as a piece of trace paper. So go ahead and grab that, and then turn your attention back to the front once you have that. Okay, so if you could turn your attention back to the front, I have a simple question for you, or rather a statement. Tell me what you see with the tables. Describe the tables to me. Long and skinny is one, and then the other one, I'm sorry? It's like short and square. Short and square, I'm sorry. Long and skinny, short and square. I did this with some students, and a student said, well, there's one table that you can lay on and one table you can sit on. And I was like, that's an interesting way to think about that. I just had never described it that way. But you see that there is difference, right? There seems to be a consensus that they are different, yes? So, but if I were to tell you that they were the same, right, that the tabletops were the same, and not just the same area, but exactly the same, would you believe me? No, right? And this makes sense, right? You're seeing it, and often, cognitive creatures. So what I do is I've given you a chance to prove that to yourself. So if you see the tables on your table are the exact ones on the screen, and you have a piece of trace paper. And so I would like you to trace the tabletop of one of the tables and then just move it over to the other table. Now, I'm not responsible for your tracing job, but go ahead and do that for me. Shocked and amazed, no? I know. So then there's a lot of suspicion. There's I must have changed the tables and put them on your table and things like that, right? So I promise they are the same, right, as what I've done up here. So this is an illusion that was done in the 1980s by a psychologist named Dr. Shepard. And to me, I think the hardest, I've done this I don't even know how many times, and the biggest challenge for me is that you have proof, right, that they're the same? Right, you have proof, but can you see that they're the same? You still can't, right? And that's something that is so important to remember, and we don't often do that, right? That even with evidence, so this takes me to my second lesson, is that even with evidence, cognitive errors can occur, right? And this is really important because your brain is doing a lot of really positive things. I mean, it's trying to help you navigate a three-dimensional world. It's making sure that you don't run into things or do different things. But this piece, especially if you start to apply some of that to people, right, and how we interact with people, we could have all the evidence in the world and still we have error. You with me so far? And this, I think, is a very, very important lesson. And so sometimes I think the best way then to address this cognitive error is by tracking, right? How do you start to track? Oftentimes I'll be in a session and someone will say, well, I had this one thing happen, is that bias? And I go, well, I don't know if that's about your unconscious bias. How many times have you done it? Have you tracked it? Do you know what the process is at your office? So we have to kind of get a little bit more extensive. I could say whether or not maybe it's prejudice or discrimination, but I can't tell whether or not what's motivating that from one instance. So tracking is incredibly important. And like I mentioned before, you're going to get some of that deeper dive with a number of the different speakers today. But mine's just kind of an overview. So for those folks who really love research, there is so much of it out there that talks about implicit bias. And so in that idea of that we are influenced, right, unconsciously, both in our behaviors and attitudes, you have to track in order to notice that. I'm not going to go through all of these research studies, but I think some ones that I think are very important that can apply sometimes to the work that we do on a daily basis have to do sometimes with personality. So that very first one around the warm and cold personalities, just by show of hands, how many folks are familiar with this study? There are a couple? Okay. So this is really interesting. So what they were trying to examine, or what they told the participants they were examining, was they were going to describe a person's personality traits. And so they had an individual get into an elevator, and there was a Confederate in the elevator who was part of the experiment but didn't know what the experiment was. And they were holding like a warm cup of coffee. And so they would rifle through their papers while they're going up in the elevator, and then they would hand the cup of coffee to the person who was in the experiment to do something. And then they would take it back, and the person would get off of the elevator. And what they found was that there was a strong correlation between if they'd been handed the cup, that they described the person in the picture as warm, friendly, team player, right? All of these things, not even realizing how they'd been subtly influenced by the warmth of a cup. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes I tell that to folks, and then they're like immediately going to go buy their boss a cup of coffee or something. I don't disagree that that could be a good strategy, but it's just something to think about with tracking, right? Something to consider. Okay, we could do the membership one too. I think that one's really, really important. So this is more related to like faculty, but what they did is they surveyed 6,500 faculty at about 250 of the top universities. And essentially what they did is they didn't survey them, they pretended to be a PhD student, and they sent out kind of this note to say, well, could you be my mentor based on my interest in your research, based on a number of different things. And then what ended up happening was they had coded names differently. So sometimes you've seen this on like resume, right? Who gets called back for different resumes. They did this instead with mentorship. And what they found is, who do you think got called back the most? White males. Yeah, so if your name is Brad Anderson, you are the guy, right, for the job. Because what they did first is they made sure that the names, people could identify both the race and the gender. So they started with that, right, which is a huge step, right, to make sure that there's an understanding of the process and validity of the process. So do you think, though, and this is what's really interesting, do you think that the race or the gender of the faculty member changed the situation? Yeah, we got some like mixed things in the room too. So this does go back to Kerwin's interesting point around we typically have preference for in-group, but actually in this study, it didn't matter, right? The race or the gender of the faculty member, Brad was still your guy, right? And that's not to be disheartening. It's just to say that we don't always recognize that kind of pattern because we think we're outside of our implicit bias, right? From my executive control, right? So we've got this kind of like caveman brain where we've learned all of these different schemas. And when we move that into this executive control place, where it's around my values, something that's maybe different or counter to what I'm doing, then I think that I have control over the whole situation. And implicit bias completely undermines that. Right? And so we have to be able to track and be aware that maybe or maybe not I am being influenced by this outside thing. Another study that I like to point out, because I know you're going to talk about a number of different things, it's not on here, but I think it applies a lot, especially given that this is a women's conference, to recommendations. So there were a number of like the top medical students had just gotten out of medical school. And what they ended up doing was they tracked the recommendations to get them into residency, right? So they'd already worked with a bunch of folks, and they compared men and women's recommendations. So this isn't even from the people who are doing the work, right? This is folks who are recommending them. And what they found was that men's recommendations letter had more connection to their CV, to their patient care, and to their research. And then on the women's side, now remember, these are the top women of their class. There was more conversation around connection to family. So she gets along really well with my wife, right? Written into the letters. There was more like doubt raisers. So for example, like I can't believe that she was able to complete medical school with her family and other responsibilities, right? So those kinds of components were in there a lot more. And there was less reference to patient care and to research. And this is a challenge, because if you are someone who's reading those recommendations, also how are you receiving that information, right? We just went through a hiring process, and that was something that was really important to us to recognize, is how are we also taking somebody else's recommendation that we have no control over their bias, even if we are more competent, right, individually. And so my main takeaway here, and I think that's important, is that if you're a researcher, you probably really dig it. You're like, yes, I will do this. I know what my system is. But then sometimes on the daily basis, the question is, how do I even personally contribute to it, though? Like I'm not hiring anybody, or I don't arrest folks in the criminal justice system. I'm not a teacher. I don't discipline individuals. So how do I personally contribute to it? Ends up being the question. And so I like to use this example, and we use this in some of my sessions at the university, to talk about how bias can be the very first step in the stage process to discrimination and oppression. So I'll give you an example, and like I said, my professor does a great example with this, and so I'll use the one that she offered. So if I have a bias, whether it's explicit or implicit, to individuals that are my own age, right, my own age, then it's very possible that I work at a university, might have a stereotype about college students, both because I work with college students and maybe because of my own experience that college students party a lot, they go out a lot, maybe they're less responsible. Now, either I know that from my own experience or I have a countering experience, but I do have that stereotype, right, that generalization, that schema around students partying. So if I do find myself in a place of hire, right, I could start to make generalizations about students that I've never met, right? Because even as I said that students party, I saw some folks in the room go, well, that wasn't my experience, and I get that. That's the whole point, right? That it's not everybody's experience, it's a generalization. But then I might start to have a prejudice against folks because I'm not complicating that stereotype enough, right? I'm not complicating it. So I only can rely on the things that I see in my lack of exposure. So then I start to kind of make these judgments, these preconceived judgments. So you have this prejudice that starts to come out, right, and show up. Now, going back to my role as a hiring manager, if I then get a resume where I can tell that it's a student, and I have kind of this bias towards folks who are my own age, I have a stereotype about students and their work ethic, I have this judgment around what they're capable or not capable of doing, then that is something that could unconsciously come into play when I'm hiring somebody. I know it seems kind of like hypothetical, but this is a very clear and common progression, more than we think, right? We just call it something else. And even more so, depending on my own personal identities, right? What my experiences are, what my identities are, right? So talking about that, if they're advantaged, right, on this privilege spectrum, then that can also influence what my bias is, how I operate within my the stereotypes that I hear, and then kind of who then ends up getting discriminated against, right? Because there is a system. There is a system that makes this very easy for me. It's not just that I prefer people that are my same age. There's a system that sets it up, that people that look like me might be in the same spaces as me. They might hold the same positions of power as me. And that's something that's really important to consider in this, how I can contribute to what it looks like, right? But even more so than that, I think it's super subtle. It's really, really subtle. But how many folks have seen this video before, the monkey business illusion? So not that many. Well, we'll show it to you during a break. I'm just going to go on to the next thing, yeah? But essentially, the task that he shares with you is to count the number of balls that the people pass back and forth. Now, the end goal here is just that there's a bit of priming that happens, right? So anytime someone gives us instructions, we end up taking those instructions and then focusing that. So when we were trying to buy a new car, my wife was obsessed with this idea of getting a CRV. Don't know why. But then after that, what do you think I saw everywhere? CRVs everywhere. I just couldn't stop seeing them. And I had never seen them before. And suddenly I was seeing them everywhere, right? So this is a really important component because it's around selective attention, right? We've heard this before, right? Maybe you're pregnant and then suddenly you see everything baby, right? Or you're thinking about getting a new job somewhere and everything associated with that job suddenly comes into your purview, right? Like you can't not see it. And so this is really important because it's the idea about priming, right? How can we be primed to say or think or do something? So for me, I think what's important here is that I'm going to kind of go through all these different ones with examples, but then I'm going to have you work at your table because these can also be applied to people. So for example, selective attention is that if I decide to only see maybe individuals who might identify as black men who wear really baggy pants, but I only see that, and I never see black men wearing anything else, then I'm going to tell you something, black men wear other things, right? Right? But I can't, if I don't see that, then that's really important for me to think about, right? That I've selectively honed in on only one thing that I want to see. Yeah, you with me? Okay. So the next one, though, is around diagnostic bias. And so this is really important because this is all about first impressions, right? And sometimes I get that a lot in my job, that someone's like, you give a first impression and then you can't let go of it. Now, I remember when I hired someone at a different institution, on their first day, they were late, their very first day. And it happens. I can't say that I've never been late to something, right? But on their first day, they were late. Now, since then, they had a perfect record for like 9 months. But then they were late again, and what do you think I thought? They're always late. Went right back to that core moment. They're always late. I can't believe that, right? But luckily, we have time records, so they could say, actually, that wasn't true, right? Because we were tracking. We were able to kind of debunk some of that process because we were tracking. What's interesting about the next one, pattern recognition, I sometimes have this with folks in my office too. So again, like I said, I work with students occasionally. And so I had a student come in once who was really, really tired. And I was like, well, what were you doing last night? Why are you so tired today? And they were out late. Turns out that you also go out on Wednesday nights now, which is a new thing. It's like getting closer to the week. And so then I was like, oh, okay, but that's a common thing. I can't, I like to socialize during the week too. It happens. So then the next time they came in and they were really tired, what do you think I thought? Yeah, they're showing this pattern of behavior. Even if they were up all night doing a group project for the next day, right? I start to have this pattern recognition. And we actually apply pattern recognition to people who we think are a part of the same category. So this happens a lot with siblings. So even if it's not about you, if you're like your sibling, and this idea of pattern recognition, I came after, so my sister is an attorney, and she is one of the smartest people that I have ever met in my life. She is so smart, and then I came after her, and I remember being like, oh no, like, what are these expectations? But that was a beneficial pattern recognition that they were like, Bria's got it, and I'm like, I don't know if I got this, but at least it was on that end, which oftentimes it's the other side, right? There's a behavioral component that comes out a lot of times in education and classrooms, and folks are saying, oh, another kid from this family. And there's a stressor there, right? Because they've tied something in that shouldn't be tied in. The next one is around confirmation bias, and I think about this a lot with where I get my information, right? Who do I go to when I want to tell them about a situation that happened? Am I going to complicate what I just said? I mean, I'm sure you have that person or that friend, right? When you go to them, you know that they might kind of set you straight in a different way, right? They might say, let's think a little bit more about what you said or did, and actually that's a little bit more problematic. And it's good to have those folks, right? I would say that this is happening a lot now with news, though. Where do we get our news? Where do we get our information? How are we talking to folks, not talking to folks? And this is especially true if the goal, or part of the goal of the conference today, is to talk about having those difficult dialogues. Being able to complicate that ahead of time for yourself is helpful, right? It allows for more room for empathy, more room for connection. The next one, though, is around anchoring bias. So how many folks love sales in the room, like bargains? Okay, a number of folks. So I think what's interesting is I'm a little indifferent, but I want to talk about my poor wife again, is that she came home the other day and she goes, I bought a pair of jeans and they were 75% off. And I went, that's wonderful. How much did they cost? And she goes, babe, they were 75% off. And I went, okay, how much did they cost? Right, so we had two very different goals because she was anchored at a very high mark, right? So it was like, oh, these must be a great deal, even if they still cost $75 or something, because they were 75% off, right? It was this big deal. They weren't actually $75, but it felt that way to me. So it's an interesting conversation then around anchoring bias, and this happens a lot with people. So if we anchor someone, right, and they can do no wrong, we've put them here. Right, and how often do we anchor people subconsciously sometimes based on identities or experiences that we've had? Now, conversely, too, I'm sure we have the folks who we've anchored down here as well, and what do they have to do to get pulled up? And it's like 10,000 times more than what this person has to do. And that's a very common thing, right? Anchoring bias is a very common daily occurrence. The last one's really interesting. It's around groupthink. So since I'm disclosing all kinds of things to you today, how many folks are familiar with like the Backstreet Boys? Okay, a number of folks. What about NSYNC? Okay, so that was a big rage when I was in high school. And I remember, though, I didn't like either one of those bands. I really liked 98 Degrees. How many folks were familiar with 98 Degrees? Okay, some folks are like, oh, me too, right? Or I don't know what to do with that, or I didn't know there was another person. There's all kinds of reactions probably. But I remember thinking that I loved this band, 98 Degrees, and everyone was like, they are the worst boy band ever. But I was like, they're a real quartet. You have all these different arguments. But eventually you get to this part where what you end up saying is, oh, well, I just kind of want to be part of the group. I just want to be kind of part of it. And so I ended up kind of being like, oh, the Backstreet Boys are all right, I guess, and kind of like floating myself over there. And this happens a lot of the time in workplaces. How we decide to describe a new person that's coming into the office. How do we talk about a new person that's coming into the office? Sometimes you have this kind of group think that ends up happening. And that's super important as well, right, to think about. And so what I think is good, and I want to also be mindful of time. I know we started a little bit late, if that's all right with you. Okay. I want you to just think at your tables, though, for just a couple of minutes of examples of any of these different categories where you've seen them play out in relation to people. right? Some of the examples I've given you, but does that sound like a plan? Do that for a couple minutes? Okay, so think about these different categories and how I've described them, and then how you've maybe seen that or considered that could play out in a workplace setting, in hiring, in law, in service, anywhere that you want to place that. Okay? Go ahead. So I think what's important, and I'm really glad to have all of you chatting about it. I think that is one of the hardest things about being a trainer is I could give you all day just to talk about that, right? Is that even just from way up here, I heard a lot of good conversation, and also the idea that they're not really separate from each other sometimes, right? I've given you 6 different examples, but there's a lot of overlap in how these play out. And what I encourage you doing is to continue that conversation outside of the session today about even if I don't know what to call it. So maybe this is confirmation bias, or maybe it's anchoring bias, or maybe it's selective attention, I'm not really sure. That's less important than the idea that you could be being influenced by something unconsciously, right? That's the key takeaway. To the point that you've seen all these different examples, you've seen some research, which brings me to my third point, which is that implicit biases are pervasive, right? We learned them very, very early on. The way that I think about it is because it's this constant need to be examined. It's like driving in a car that's constantly being pulled off the road, right? You have to keep adjusting. You have to keep being aware of what you're doing. So then it brings me to this next point, which is really around like, what do we do? Being here is a great place to be. Doing the work that you're doing is fantastic. And I'm not going to go through a number of different strategies, but what I do encourage you to do is to think about them on these individual, interpersonal, and institutional levels as you're learning things today. How can you put into place some of those strategies that you're hearing? So on the interpersonal level, how do I then, think about implicit bias as it relates to some of those daily operations that I just shared with you, right? Am I, thinking about or using confirmation bias when I'm trying to complicate something that I know? Or on an interpersonal level, perhaps you decide that it's really important to have an experience in a religious institution that's different than your own, right? What do I do and how do I do that? And how do I create, connection or coalition across difference? Or if you're in charge of policy or procedure or how we even track feedback. I don't know how many groups I've worked with who are having climate issues and there's no system to give anonymous feedback or to even track what the climate looks like within that space, and ourselves included, right? I'm not devoid of that at my institution. So I encourage you to think about these different things because that brings me to my final point, which is that implicit biases are malleable. There's a lot of attention to it. If you're able to think about strategies for debiasing or like what you can do there. We have a lot of resources in our office that I'm more than happy to share, but I know that you're going to get lots and lots of information today. So what I want to leave you with, because I want to make sure to leave time obviously for other speakers, is this charge. The first one is to think about your lessons that you've learned today. Right? Already this morning, what have we talked about? What are those 4 lessons? Do they apply to you and do they apply to your work? And even more specifically, if there was something that was uncomfortable that was said or done, how do you lean into that just a little bit more? Right? How can we learn from discomfort, that dissonance, remember, not just quickly filing something into something? And really embracing some of the information that you could hear, right? I think what's interesting is how we decide to believe something or not, right? When we decide to believe something or not. Going back to the table that I shared with you, right? Even though you have evidence, do you still believe it or not believe it? The next point, I think, is to really think critically about your role. One, how are you already trying to dismantle systems, right? What are ways that you haven't thought about in order to maybe how you are contributing or not contributing to systemic inequities? And then what can you do more generally? Because I think that that's the most important thing. And that brings me back to this last part, which is about focusing on self, is that I think it is very easy. Well, easy is the wrong word. I would say that my office makes a joke that if everybody just did their own work, we'd be out of a job, right? If everybody did their work all the time, I wouldn't have a job. And I would be really okay with that if it was that simple. But I do think that there is something to focusing on self, right? Focusing on what you can control, how you are contributing, because the system and systemic inequities is overwhelming. It's not saying that we should ignore it or not be part of it. You absolutely should. And also ground that sometimes in yourself and your behaviors and your actions. Because I think what that allows you to do is to engage with the work differently, to see truth where maybe you thought there wasn't truth before. And so I encourage you to focus on yourself, especially throughout the last bit of today. We all have work to do, like I said, myself included, and it's a very long and hard road, but I believe in you, and I believe that change can happen. And I just want to say thank you so much for having me this morning, and I really hope you enjoy the conference. So thank you.